"You're safe now," Jonah Hale said, the words low as the snow that drifted off the lip of the mountain. The land around them was white as a blank page, the tall pines bowed with snow, the sky a hard, colorless dome. He'd been riding the eastern trail when a sound cut through the wind, not the howl of the mountain, but the small, urgent cry of an infant. Jonah turned his mare and pulled to a stop at the edge of a narrow clearing, the horse stamping and exhaling steam. There she was, slumped against a splintered fence post, her wrists bound with wire and cloth, face raw and bruised where someone had beaten her with cruel hands. Her hair was frozen at the edges, lashes crusted with ice. The breath that left her was small, a draft of white that barely rose. At her feet lay 3 small bundles half buried in the drift. One squealed, thin and fierce. The other 2 were still, as if sleep had taken them too early. Jonah dropped from the saddle and moved before his thoughts settled. He cut the bindings quick, hands steady, even as the wind tore at his coat. She woke to the sound of a voice she could not have known. "Name's Jonah," he said simply. "You're coming with me." She tried to speak, but only a ragged sound came. He wrapped his poncho carefully around the babies, pressing cloth to their little faces until they blinked and showed warmth. He lifted her with an ease that surprised her. He made no fuss, only motion, as if he had often stepped up when the world broke. He set her on his horse between his arms, children bundled against her chest. The half-mile back to his cabin would be a treacherous ride. The wind whistled like the last animal in its throat. Jonah rode anyway, one hand steady on the reins, the other bracing the woman, his jaw set to something like promise.
The cabin smelled of smoke and old wool. The fire had long been banked low. Jonah crouched at the hearth and fed it, coaxing light into hungry coals. He laid her on quilts piled in the corner and unwrapped the babies one at a time, checking lungs and pink beneath their thin skin. He warmed milk in an iron cup and fed 'em with a wooden spoon he'd carved for the purpose. The smallest licked the rim like a stray cat, then cried with new strength. The others followed, weak but stubborn. The woman slept in fits, breaths shallow and long. When she opened her eyes, her voice was a broken thing. Mara Kinley." Jonah offered no other name. He moved about the cabin with the quiet efficiency of a man used to keeping spaces alive, pulling wet boots by the hearth and laying pelts where bones would otherwise meet cold. He washed dried blood from a calf with warm water and made small, steady repairs to the lacerated skin with linen from a trunk. The bruises were old and cruel. They spoke of more than a single night's violence. Mara's mouth pressed into a thin line when she saw the babies breathing beside the fire. She looked like a woman returned from a long dark. Jonah sat and watched the family reassemble in the small light. He did not ask where she had come from or whose hand had given her bruise and shame. On nights like that, questions were dangerous. Answers could bring men to doors. He simply fed the children and tended the fire and let the quiet do what it could.
Over the next days, the cabin filled with slow recovery. Warmth moved from hearth to hands to cheeks. The babies, named by no one yet, sucked and hiccuped their way back to shape. Mara taught herself breathing between each small task. And Jonah kept his head down, bringing meat and roots and a small jug of cream. When she managed to sit up, she told him, "Joseph Thornton married me when I was small. He wanted sons. I gave him 3 girls. Her eyes found the sleeping bundles. He called me failed, said the world had no use for me. They tied me at the post and laughed, left us." Jonah's face remained as weathered as ever. He pressed his thumb into the wood of his stool and said, after a long moment, "Not here." Mara blinked, some of the clenched hardness of winter in her dissolving into something like disbelief. She reached for one of the tiny hands and held it the way someone holds a map to find a way home. Jonah wrapped a fur cloak around the sleeping children and nailed a small board above the cradle with 3 carved names, Lila, Betsy, and Ann, 1 plank for each, letters rough but true. The sight of them made Mara curl her fingers tight in the blanket and release a sound that might have been a laugh. Trust, she felt, was a thing that could be sewn back, as if with quiet stitches.
Word travels in valleys like a second storm, and within 2 weeks Jonah knew the rumor mills below had begun to churn. Men had been seen at the lower switchbacks, asking travelers about a woman who had run from her house with 3 girls. Joseph Thornton was wealthy enough to throw coin at any problem. He'd hired men to fetch what he called his property. Jonah and Mara steeled themselves. The rancher in town who'd traded with Jonah once told him to give the place up. It wasn't safe for a woman worth anything to a man like Thornton. Jonah only tightened the shutters and bolted the door. It was Hester who came up the trail, a thin, wind-burned woman with a horse that shook from the journey. She'd once worked in the general store down in Greer's Hollow and knew how men behaved when their reputations were at stake. "They mean to come," she said without preamble. "He's called 'em together. They'll take what he says is his. I brought a pouch, salt, jerky, coins." Jonah accepted the small gifts with a nod and stored them away. He did not say the words that counted. "We'll fight, we'll die for them." He did not have to. Mara watched his hands and understood. The cabin became a place of waiting and small tasks. They stored food in the root cellar, reinforced the door, and stacked wood high. Mara learned to cut and mend, and Jonah taught her how to track a deer and where the trout ran fastest. Laughter returned in fits, first as the babies reached for spoons, then as one of them sneezed and the other 2 answered in chorus. They named them not only by carved letters, but by the sound of their voices. Life became, for the first time in months, something less like survival and more like promise. Spring brings thaw and brings men from the lowlands in equal measure. They arrived, 3 in the lead, rough coats, faces like stones. The first man to speak had scars on his cheek and a cocked bravado that fell flat against Jonah's quiet. "Jonah hail," he called. "By right of the law and the word of Joseph Thornton, we've come to return his wife and children." Mara's hand closed on Jonah's. She felt the wooden grain and the quiet steady there. Jonah stepped out into the snow and let the wind carry his answer. "You'll find no wife of his here."
He leaned on the porch rail with his one good shoulder and watched the men's faces. When the lead man threatened and raised his voice, Jonah did the thing he'd rarely done. He spoke with low certainty. "You can take my life, but you take no soul that's not willing." One of the gang swung a rifle butt and cut a welt across Jonah's shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall. Before punches could be struck again, horses snorted as Sheriff Colby and 2 deputies thundered into view. The law was slow to come up the mountain, but when it did, it came like a bell. Joseph Thornton was in the lead man's camp, chest reddened with temper, but when he saw the sheriff's star, his bravado frayed. Thornton tried to claim the women were his property, that a husband could reclaim what he'd borne. The sheriff listened, marching forward with a ledger of his own, and said the town had heard rumors of beatings and illegal confinement. Thornton's mouth went thin. The deputies cuffed the men and dragged them to the sled. For the first time in months, Mara felt not only warmth, but something like safety. Jonah tended his wound with a hand steady from habit and from the knowledge that he would not be felled by a single blow. Mara refused to leave his side as the sheriff questioned them and took statements beneath a hard sky. She spoke with a voice that shook once and then held. "He threatened me," she said daughters were useless, that they were a shame. He left us to the night. The sheriff's face softened in places where law could be more than ledger. He promised to escort them down to town if they wished, to make sure that Thornton was held to answer. Jonah refused the escort. "They get to keep their stories," he said. "We get to keep our lives." After the men had been taken down the trail, the cabin around Jonah and Mara returned to the small rituals of recovery. Jonah drove a peg into the earth and set a clothesline. Mara mended the clothes quilts with thread that matched little hearts to stitch 'em stronger. The girls grew plumper by the day, and the sound of their play began to echo across the yard. Travelers who stopped for stew and a warm bed left words of praise, coins, and sometimes an extra bolt of cloth or thread. The hearth at Hale's Ridge became slowly a stop for the road-weary. People who came discovered more than food. They found a house that had risen from a broken thing and become a place where the lost were kept safe.
Time doesn't erase memory. It packs it like cordwood, layer upon layer, but it softens the immediate edges. Jonah and Mara learned the rhythms of living together. He rose with the light and tracked. She tended the garden and taught the girls to count on fingers and to hum old lullabies. The days held small arguments and larger comforts. They shared a small language of glances over the fire, a shorthand of things unsaid. Jonah never asked for thanks, and Mara learned how to give 'em without making them feel like debts. One evening, as the sun sank, Jonah presented a small token, a strip of leather with a knot at the end, and 3 tiny carved wooden beads for the girls. He looped them on each little wrist as they slept, a simple charm to keep wolves away. Mara took his hand without fuss and held it for a long moment. No promises shouted from the ridge, no vows made with flourishes. Instead, they chose to keep watch. That night they slept closer than they had the first week they met, and Jonah woke with the feeling that the cabin and the people in it were a single thing, bound by more than skin and timber. Word finally reached the valley that Joseph Thornton had been brought to justice. The sheriff's report called what Thornton's men had done an unlawful abandonment and multiple counts of cruelty. Joseph's men, under the law's weight and the town's hush, were fined and some jailed. Thornton, his holdings tarnished by scandal, faded into rumor and shame. Mara read the notice by the window and felt a bitter pleasure like the tang of iron. She had once thought the world had only cruelty to offer. It had instead offered a strange redemption, law landing like a net where brutality had once been allowed to run free. The cabin thrummed with new life. People passed through for reasons small and large, a lost plow, a letter bound for the lowlands, a trader with a child who'd never seen a mountain. Mara taught local children to sew, and Jonah fixed broken wagons at the back of his shed. The girls grew into the seasons, their hair wild as the summer grass. Once, while the children played, Mara found Jonah on the porch, sanding a board. He had whittled the 3 girls' names into a pair of toy horses, their little faces lit when he gave 'em each a piece. She sat down beside him and put her head on his shoulder as the sun warmed the wood. Years ground forward, gentle as a wheel. The girls chased chickens and learned to read by the light of the hearth. Travelers spoke of Hale's Ridge as a place where a stranger could find stew and a bed and perhaps a story to remember. Once on a late afternoon, when the sky was silver and the scent of rain softened the air, Jonah took Mara's hand and drew her close. There were no rings, no grand gathering. Instead, he handed her a shawl he'd had hidden for some time, burgundy cloth stitched by a woman in the town who'd become their friend. On the corner, he'd woven tiny initials, L.B.A. She pressed the cloth to her cheek and let tears come. "You chose us," she said. He only nodded. Words had always failed to carry the heft of what they had done. Instead, he made a small promise that morning, in motion and touch. "I'll guard this fire." She gave him her hand. That was their vow. There were nights when the wind returned hungry, and the mountain showed its old temper. But the cabin at Hale's Ridge would not be beaten flat. The hearth burned with the same steady glow it had carried since Jonah dragged Mara in from the snow. The girls grew into lively things who would run ahead shouting, barefoot and laughing, until the dusk swallowed the sound. Jonah and Mara, older by a few gray threads and by 1,000 small kindnesses, sat together on the porch and watched them. They had been strangers brought together by cruelty and cold, and had built from that ruin a life. If you passed by, you would see a small home with a warm roof and a garden patched with vegetables, 3 carved names above a cradle, a line of toys drying in the sun, and you would know, even if you didn't know the whole story, that these people had chosen one another. Not because the world had been kind to them,
not because they had all the answers, but because they had decided to protect what they had. In that country where justice was often thin and warmth even rarer, Jonah and Mara proved something stubborn and true. The strongest homes are built from promises kept by hands willing to work, from courage shown when leaving would have been easier, and from choosing each other again and again. If this moved you, if it stirred something you wear quiet in your own chest, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales of frost and fire, of men and women who refused to let the worst of winter decide their ending. Tap the bell so you never miss a story that just might stay with you.